Audrey Rose, and today we're going to be talking about the Euthyphro dilemma of Plato. This was inspired by Mr. Ben Burgess, and basically it's this very famous dilemma that we find in Plato in the dialogue named Euthyphro, where he's going to be asking the question, is it good because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it is good? This is quite a moral paradox because it would suggest either one of two things. One, God chooses. Now, also, I will note, it's very important to realize that in the original wording, Plato talks about, Socrates, Plato through Socrates, it depends, will say the gods love it, or does the gods love it because it is good? That wording right there is quite important because you have a different theology, a different creative mythology, and all those things are going to impact the way that this dilemma unfolds and that one addresses this dilemma. If I were to reword the dilemma in terms of, say, Christianity, which I will do because that's the most popular religion in America, but you could do a similar thing with Islam, Hinduism, so on and so forth. You could ask, is it good because God loves it, or does God love it because it is good? If God loves it because it is good, there's a sense in which goodness is independent of God. It exists independent of God. So then it would be strange to suggest that God is the source of goodness, and it would suggest that there's that goodness is kind of over God, which would be strange. But on the other hand, if you say that it's good because God says it's good, then it can seem kind of arbitrary. Why did, God said it was good? Well, why? And Mr. Burgess makes the argument that you don't really escape moral relativism this way. You just kind of move it up the chain, and you say that, there's a relativism here because God chose X instead of Y, and so on and so forth. And Mr. Burgess also makes the point that if you say, well, God's nature is X, and God has to do what's good, well, why does God have to do what's good? That doesn't really escape the paradox. And why does X align with God's nature to be good and not Y? So there's kind of this relativism that becomes very difficult to escape. This will suggest many long, like the theological debate regarding Karl Barth in Princeton University. Does God have to follow his nature? Does he create his nature? To what degree is he radically free? To what degree is he compelled by himself? There are a lot of questions that this opens up, and I think it's quite significant. At the same time, I think a lot of the problem develops when we separate the creative act from the active ethical designation. So, for example, the way that the paradox is worded is as if things exist independent of creation, and then the gods decide if they're going to acknowledge the things that exist as good or bad. When really we have to understand that in Christianity at least, things are created and good at the same time, that the creative act and the act of moral designation goes together. And then this begs the question, from what does the moral designation arise? I think the best thinker on this is Austin Farrer. He was a great Leibniz scholar. He was a friend of C.S. Lewis. His book, Finite and the Infinite, is magnificent. And he makes the point, if I were to take Dr. William Wilson's reading of Austin Farrer and the way he puts it, which I think is excellent. The way I'm able to tell the difference between a weed and a flower in a garden is because of the design. A garden is designed, say, to yield corn, tomatoes, and things like that. And the way I'm able to tell the difference between a weed and a flower is because of the design. And so right and wrong, good and bad, are relative to design. And it is very difficult to determine good and bad without design. So the moment you say that is good or that is bad, it has to be relative to some sort of framework, some sort of design, some sort of model, or things like that. This also brings to mind Dr. Michael Sandel in his famous Justice lecture at Harvard will talk about how it's very difficult to do ethics without some form of purpose or even teleology. Now, teleology is a dangerous term to bring up, but basically you have to ask the question of what is a thing in order to determine if it is good or if it is bad. He goes to this example of this debate on if golf carts should be allowed to be used in golf, and there's this question of, is walking in golf, walking to where the ball lands, is that essential to the sport of playing golf? Or is it accidental? Is it non-essential, to use those Aristotelian terms? And that was a big Supreme Court debate. And basically, the question of if you should be allowed to use a golf court or not is indivisible from what is golf. What is the sport of golf? And you're going to then, therefore, gradually start to realize that questions of ontology and ethics are inseparable, because what a thing should do and ought to do is very much tied to what it is. Another example, I could theoretically take a boat and put it in the middle of a street, But is this what boats are for? No, there is something that you lose when you put a boat in a street that just cannot manifest unless it is in water. Boats are made for water, therefore it is good for boats to be in water. That doesn't mean boats can't be on a road, but the moment you put them on a road, they lose something. They lose something of which makes them boats. And now they're kind of competing with cars, and boats suck as cars. Therefore, boats are bad in that context because they're practically functioning or acting as if they are a car when they are not a car. So you get a disconnect between what the thing is and what it does. Now, one could argue, oh, that's arbitrary. That's subjective. That's just taste. I personally think that boats should be used on roads and can be used on land. And but the issue is that the raw facticity of the fact that the boat can't float like it's made to do is from which we derive the claim that it is not good for boats to be in the middle of a highway. Not some arbitrary preference. There is facts, there is facticity, there is physical reality, of which deprives the object of a boat something that it is capable of doing in a different context. Now, again, I'm not saying someone should go to jail for putting a boat on a highway. One is not saying that you can't, say, perhaps use a boat as a house if you were to, say, remove the bottom, redesign it, and put it on land, and then it can be a sort of house. So we're not meaning to say that there aren't creative possibilities that can be arrived at relative to a boat and new ideas, but that would be a new design. That would be a new model. The way that a boat should be used is relative to a design. You can't get away from this. Likewise, if you believe that humans exist to flourish and to be happy, to procreate, whatever your definition of what the human is, your ethics of what humans should do and be allowed to do and how they should interact will all correspond to that ontology. So basically, when you're dealing with ethics, you cannot escape questions of ontology. And this brings us back to the dilemma. You see, God created the world. And the moment he creates a world, there's a few things that occur. That there is a design. And without that design, you couldn't even have ethics. So there has to be some kind of design. And that design or model could be derived from an atheistic conception of the physical reality, or it can be derived from an idea of how God intended things to go. But you have to have some sort of model, some sort of design. But anyway, you have this idea that God says things are good relative to what things are. It's not, this is the key. So, for example, God will say it's not good for man to be alone in Genesis because man is a creature of which is social. Notice that it is not that God looks God looks at some sort of list and sees, oh, community equals good. Therefore, we're going to tell man to be in community, to be with other people, as if the moral law exists independent of the human being, the creation and being, the ontology of the human being. No, what ends up happening is God's command is relative to the thing that is the human being, not relative to an idea of what human beings should do when they could do anything. There are things of which humans can do that relative to what they can do and what they are is better than other things. In the same way that there are things a boat can do and things a boat can be placed that are better than others. Not because it's impossible, say, to put a boat on land, but because something is lost if boats are put on land versus if boats are in water. Likewise, something is lost if human beings are not in community, if they are alone. Something is lost that can only be arrived in a relational context. Now, note, that doesn't mean it's always bad for human beings to be alone. That's not to say that solitude is always bad, but that there's something about community that is very, very important. Now, what's also interesting is that it's a different topic, but everything I'm saying so far, I should note, does not necessarily perfectly bring us to some sort of divine command ethic or something like that, where God says, it's good to be in community, therefore, because we have to also figure out what it means to be in community. Even if we agree that saying murder is always wrong as an objective category, there still has to be the interpretive act of determining what falls under murder and what falls under killing. So, some of the more traditional, dare I say, conservative views of ethics as being very objective and straightforward are going to prove inadequate, because you do have to have a hermeneutical conception to determine what falls under the category of the design of that thing versus not. So you're going to end up here, I like to talk about absolute moral conditionalism, which is, dare I say, a middle ground between objective, traditional absolutist ethics and hard relativism or something like that. Anyway, so what that would mean is if we decide that human beings are X design, And that therefore why is what humans ought to do and what helps with human flourishing. We still have to determine what falls under the category of contributing to human flourishing. So there's still an interpretive act. There's still a lot of room of debate to go on and so forth. So this is not all to say that we can overcome the Euthyphro dilemma into simple divine command ethics. There's still much more work that has to be done. The main thing that I think I'll go back to is when you come to this paradox and it says, is it good because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it is good? To reword this, what we need to ask is it good because God made it, or did God make it because it was good? If you take out the word love and replace it with make, then we can start to approach this in a new way. Because the question becomes, did God make it because it was good, or is it good because God made it? Well, we see in something like 1 Timothy in the Bible where it says everything that God created is good as long as it's brought with a spirit of thanksgiving. This is quite interesting. And also say in Genesis, God makes creation, says it is good. So there'd be a suggestion here that everything that exists is good. So God made it because it is good. And why is it good? Well, this is critical. If it's good because it's in the spirit of thanksgiving, it's good because it is toward God. Another way to put this is that it isn't so much that God says that this is good or this isn't good, but rather things are either toward God or not. And it is that towardness which God says is good. It's in a way, it's not so much food that is good, but food used toward helping creatures participate in God's design, God's will. And his design and will are going to be extension of God's self, because there's no break between God's being and God's essence. This is going to actually get kind of, I think, another way to address Euthyphro, because it's not so much that God looks at things and says they are good, which would bring you to the whole dilemma. Is the goodness of that thing independent of God, or is it arbitrary? God's arbitrarily deciding what is good. But rather, what's happening is God's looking at things and seeing if they are toward him or not, and it's the relation which is good or bad, not the thing. And the relation is toward God, and God is good. And so things are good if they relate to God in their towardness. Things are not so much good. Everything is good, actually, according to the Bible. In that first part in 1 Timothy, it's a notion of things, everything is good that's created, brought to God with a spirit of thanksgiving. So that's to suggest a certain relation. And everything has to have a relation to God, because God has to exist if things exist, and therefore everything has some relation to God, and it's either toward God or away from God. Now, of course, you have to get into the debate of what is away from God and what is toward God, but that would just get you into moral discussions and debates. But you wouldn't have at the heart a moral paradox at the very heart of theological ethics, because it moves to the relation. And so things are good things are good in a relation which is secondary to their ontology, which would then get you into freedom. And then basically what that means, as the paper discussed, is that you move the question of arbitrariness from morality to creating at all. So you could say, okay, Dan, well, fine, things are good in their relation to God or not, and they must have a relation to God because God must exist. But then, why did God create? He didn't have to create, and so creation is ultimately arbitrary. Ergo, the garden itself, the design itself, is ultimately arbitrary. And you could make that argument. We were saying earlier that the difference between a weed and a flower is determined in a garden relative to a design, and you could say, well, the garden itself is arbitrary. You don't have to make a garden. Even if you could say that, sure, there is a meaningful and concrete ethics within the garden itself doesn't have to be created, that the garden is arbitrary. And sure, that's a very fair point. You can just say that God didn't have to create, and so creation is arbitrary. Well, that's fine, because now we're moving to the realm of axioms, and that's the main thing we want to do with the Euthyphro dilemma, is move from the realm of moral paradox to the realm of axiom. Certainly, God, you could argue God didn't have to create, and then say something like, that's why it's a free choice. That's why God is love, because he didn't have to create, but he still chose to. And in a sense, it's arbitrary. But it's an expression of grace. In a sense, grace is arbitrary, that God would arbitrarily choose to save sinners. There's something arbitrary about that, but that would just be part of love. So the creative act of creation itself is quote-unquote arbitrary, but you could say it's freely giving, that it's an act of grace, and God is love. Therefore, the decision of God to create is axiomatic. There are some theologians who want to say that God had to create because it was in his essence to create, and so he's compelled by his own necessity. Other theologians will say that no, God chose it as a complete free act. He wasn't compelled by anything. There are different theologians who come down on different sides, and that's a very big theological discussion. But we're moving the discussion out of a moral paradox to something more axiomatic, and that's a key move, because we ultimately are moving into axioms. You're ultimately going to get into the question of why did God give man free will versus make us robots, which is Ivan Karmosov. And so, but basically what I'm getting at is that Euthyphro's dilemma, which is a moral paradox, you can overcome the moral paradox, which suggests a kind of contradiction in theological ethics, and instead get to an axiomatic assent. And at that point, it's just an internally consistent system. You either agree with it or not. You're either an atheist or a theist. But there's no necessary contradiction in theological ethics that is brought out by this dilemma. Because ultimately it's because ultimately it's God seeing himself in things and those things participating in him. Because here's the point. God designs things to worship him, to be toward him. Therefore, whatever contributes to things participating and being toward him are therefore good. So their goodness is not independent of him or God. Their goodness is God when things are toward him. So when God looks at everything, when he creates everything to be toward him and says it is good because it is toward him. So God makes it because it is good, because God makes in everything the possibility to be toward him. And at the point of Genesis 1, in the beginning of the Bible, everything is toward him until the fall. And then at the fall, it's possible for things to choose to be away from God, to not be oriented toward God, therefore not to flourish and according to God, therefore not meet the design of what they originally have to be toward God. And that leads to sin and privation and so on and so forth, which then, of course, is possible because of free will. And then the question is, why did God give us free will? And ultimately that's Ivan Karmosov, the Grand Inquisitor, and that ultimately is going to point out why the Grand Inquisitor is a much stronger argument against say Christianity than the Euthyphro dilemma, because ultimately the Grand Inquisitor is just going to point out that you're dealing with an axiomatic problem. Another thing that, say, theists may respond to is they'll say, well, sure, there's a kind of moral relativism in God, quote unquote, arbitrarily saying that X is good versus Y, but God has authority, whereas when humans say X is good versus Y, we don't have divine authority, and it's more of in terms of preference and taste. But when God says X is good, it's ontological, it's vertical, to use Kierkegaardian language. It's very, very deep. So that would be another response to the problem. How people would deal with it. But anyway, ontology and ethics are always tied together. Truth organizes values. What we believe is true constitutes what we believe are the right values, the right ethical way to live, so on and so forth. And what ends up happening is, since God created everything is good when it's toward him. And so what he's ultimately seeing when he says that things are good is he sees towardness toward him, so he sees himself. So God, in a way, is referring to himself as good. So there is no separation between God and goodness, therefore goodness is not over God. Ultimately, it is one with God. God is one with his nature. It is not separate, so his nature doesn't have control over him. And the goodness of things is a result of to the degree they are toward him, not following some sort of command independent of their ontology. And ultimately, everyone's ethics has to be derived, ultimately, everyone's ethics, not just theology, has to be arranged in some sort of model design or schema by which the ethics can be organized, like that garden, which we need to tell the difference between a flower and a weed in Austin Farah. And that means everyone's just in the same game. The theist, the atheist, the secularist, so on and so forth. Everyone is in the same game of determining an ethical system relative to what they think is the model of the universe, the correct model of the universe. And then the question becomes, is what ultimate macro model is correct? And nobody knows. You'd have to be God to know that. And if you say, well, I believe in a God who chose to give us a macro model of free will, ultimately you say, I believe God is all-knowing. He knows of the best of all possible worlds. To allude to Leibniz, he chose this one. Therefore, I have reason to think that this model of ethics is best. And someone could simply say, I don't follow your axiom, and disagree, and we go from there. So this is an axiomatic disagreement. It is not one. The Euthyphro dilemma points to an axiomatic disagreement. It is not necessitating a moral paradox that unveils reveals the logical contradiction of theistic ethics. It is simply unveiling that theistic ethics is based on an axiom, just like everyone's ethics is based on axioms. For more by Mr. Ben Burgess, please see his YouTube page. He does tremendous work. I enjoy all of his work. Give them an argument. So please see his channel. For more by OG Rose, please see ogrose.com. And thank you for your time.